Chapter 12. When they walked in, Amanda's mother was busy with her usual tools, a yellow plastic bucket and a sponge. She was scrubbing purple crayon off the TV screen. "Mom," said Amanda, "this is Jeffrey." She whispered, "What's your last name?" "Magee." She said, "Magee." Miss Beale held up her hand. "Hold it," and went on scrubbing. When she finally finished, she straightened up and turned and said, "Now what?" "Mom, this is Jeffrey Magee, you know." Amanda was hardly finished when Maniac zipped across the room and stuck out his hand. "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Beale." "Mrs. Beale." They shook hands. Mrs. Beale smiled. "So you're the book boy," she started nodding. Amanda came home one day. "Mom, there's this boy I loaned one of my books to." "Loaned a book, you?" "Mom, he practically made me. He really likes books. I met him on—" "Mom," Amanda screeched, "I never said all that." Miss Beale nodded solemnly. "No, of course you didn't," and gave Maniac a huge wink, which made Amanda screech even louder, until something crashed in the kitchen. Mrs. Beale ran, Amanda and Maniac ran. The scene in the kitchen stopped them cold. One little girl, eyes wide, standing on the countertop. One little boy, eyes wide, standing just below her on a chair. And one shattered glass jar and some stingy, pale-colored gloop on the floor. One growing cloud of sauerkraut fumes. The girl was Hester, age 4. The boy was Lester, age 3. In less than 5 minutes, while Miss Beale and Amanda cleaned up the floor, Hester and Lester and their dog Bow Wow were out in the backyard wrestling and tickling and jumping and just generally going wild with their new buddy and victim, Maniac Magee. Maniac was still there when Mr. Beale came home from his Saturday shift at the tire factory. He was there for dinner when Hester and Lester pushed their chairs alongside his. He was there to help Amanda mend her torn book, and he was there watching TV afterward, with Hester riding one knee, Lester on the other. He was there when Hester and Lester came screaming down the stairs with the book, Amanda screaming even louder behind them, the kids shoving the book and themselves onto Maniac's lap. Amanda finally calming down because they didn't want to cray on her book. They only wanted Maniac to read. And so he read Lyle, Lyle, Crocodile to Hester and Lester, and even though they pretended not to listen, to Amanda and Mr. Beale and Mrs. Beale. And he was there when Hester and Lester were herded upstairs to bed, and Mrs. Beale said, "Don't you think it's about time you're heading home, Jeffrey? Your parents will be wondering." So Maniac, wanting to say something but not knowing how, got into the car for Mr. Beale to drive him home. And then he made his mistake. He waited for only 2 or 3 blocks before saying to Mr. Beale, "This is it." Mr. Beale stopped, but he didn't let Maniac out of the car. He looked at him funny. Mr. Beale knew what his passenger apparently didn't. East End was East End, and West End was West End, and the house that this white lad was pointing to was filled with black people just like everybody else up till Hector Street. Mr. Beale pointed this out to Maniac. Maniac's lips started to quiver, and right there with the car idling in the middle of the street, Maniac told him that he didn't really have a home unless you counted the deer shed at the zoo. Mr. Beale made a U-turn right there and headed back. Only Mrs. Beale was downstairs when they walked into the house. She listened to no more than 10 seconds worth of Mr. Beale's explanation before saying to Maniac, "You're staying here." Not long after, Maniac was lying in Amanda's bed, Amanda having been carried over to Hester and Lester's room, where she often slept anyway. Before Maniac could go to sleep, however, there was something he had to do. He flipped off the covers and went downstairs. Before the puzzled faces of Mr. and Mrs. Beale, he opened the front door and looked at the 3 cast-iron digits nailed to the doorframe. 728. He kept staring at them, smiling. Then he closed the door and said cheerfully, "Good night," and went back to bed. Maniac Magee finally had an address. Chapter 13. Amanda was happy to give up her room to Maniac. It was an excuse for her to sleep with Hester and Lester every night. Most of the time during the day, the little ones drove her crazy. She couldn't stand to be in the same hemisphere with them. But at night, the best thing was to have them snuggled on both sides of her. It made no sense, but that's how it was. Mr. Beale divided the little one's room into 2 sections with a panel of plywood, and Amanda moved her stuff into the back part, except for her suitcase of books. That stayed in her old room with Maniac. The way Maniac fit in, you would have thought he was born there. He played with the little ones and read them stories and taught them things. He took Bow Wow out for runs, and he did the dishes without anybody asking, which made Amanda feel guilty, so she started to dry. He carried out the trash, mowed the grass, cleaned up his own spills, turned out lights, put the cat back on the toothpaste tube, flushed the toilet, and, as Miss Beale called it, the miracle on Sycamore Street, he kept his room neat. Every morning, Miss Beale looked into it. No socks on the floor, no drawers open, no messed-up bed. That was the most amazing thing, the bed. It looked as if it hadn't been slept in, which she soon found out was the case. Late one night, she opened the door and found Maniac sleeping on the floor. She lugged him to the bed, and but the next night he was back on the floor. Maniac just couldn't stand being too comfortable. Lying on the mattress gave him a weird feeling of slowly rising on a scoop of mashed potatoes. He was that way with chairs, too. If he had a choice, he usually sat on the floor. Other strange things happened in that house, such as the yellow bucket and sponge spent more time gathering dust in the cellar and less in Miss Beale's hand. Because with Maniac around, Hester and Lester lost their interest in crayoning everything in sight, and therefore sometimes, for 15 minutes in a row, Miss Beale was seen doing something she hadn't done since the little ones were born. Nothing. Such as Amanda started leaving her suitcase of books home. Such as everybody's fingertips started to heal because Maniac took over the endless, thankless job of untying Hester and Lester's sneaker knots. Such as Hester and Lester started to enjoy taking baths, which was a solution to a very huge problem in the Beales house. Once upon a time, Hester and Lester loved to get a bath, as long as Amanda got one with them. It was a little crowded, especially when the little ones added their boats and floating dinosaurs, but it was fun and warm and yelpy and soapy. Then came the day when Amanda entered 4th grade, and she decided she was getting too old to tub it with her little brother and sister. They begged her, but she wouldn't get in. They tried to storm the bathroom when she was in there, but she locked the door. And so the little ones went on strike. They placed their hand on Lyle Lyle Crocodile and swore they would never take another bath until Amanda joined them. And even though they couldn't stop their much larger mother from lifting them up and putting them in the water, they could refuse to touch the soap or washcloth. They could make her do it. And they could sit there all stiff with their chins down on their chest and their arms folded tight and their legs clamped together. And if their mother wanted to wash their armpits, she would have to get a crowbar and pry their arms up because they sure as heck were not going to move. And that's how it was for a long time, until Maniac arrived. On that first Sunday, as soon as the little ones found out that their new pal had slept over, they mobbed him. Jeffrey, get a bath with us, will you? Jeffrey replied, sure, okay, not thinking much about it. After all, it was still before breakfast. But the little ones never let up, and at exactly 9:15 a.m., the 3 of them got into the tub. By the time they got out, it was too late to go to church and almost lunchtime. From then on, the baths usually took place at night. Sometimes Miss Beale would poke in her head and stare. One little black girl, one little black boy, one medium white boy, and she would smile and wag her head and say, never saw such a tub. The time she heard Lester and Hester yelling for help, though, she was downstairs. She came running. What's the matter? The little ones pointed. Look! She looked. Maniac was covered with blotches, round, red blotches, all shiny from the bathwater. They looked something like pepperoni. They took him to the doctor. The doctor took a look and said it wasn't chickenpox and it wasn't measles. He said it might be an allergy. He asked what the boy had for dinner. Mr. Beale said pizza. Well, the doctor said, can't be that. Can you imagine a youngster getting sick on pizza? Everybody laughed. Besides, said the doctor, this would have shown up on him since he was very little, most likely every time he came near a pizza. He turned to Maniac, still laughing. You have eaten pizza before, haven't you? Maniac got a funny expression on his face. He looked around. Everybody was staring at him. The silence grew longer. Eyes grew wider. And that's how they found out that Maniac Magee was allergic to pizza.